Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to be checking for Linux and Windows specific vulnerabilities with OpenVAS or OpenVAS as it's so called. Alright, so let's get started. Now I hope you've started the you've actually started OpenVAS and you've opened up VS in your browser through the local host. So the default port is 9392. You've got your credentials, so the default username is admin and the password is a long string that they'll provide to you in the terminal after you've ran the OpenVAS setup. So again, as I said, you can change it in OpenVAS, and I'll be showing you how to do that in a few seconds. Alright, so welcome to OpenVAS, and I hope you like the interface. So let's actually start off with the interface. So you might be asking yourself, well, this looks quite different than Nessus. Well, the truth is OpenVAS offers you a lot more flexibility in terms of the types of scans you can perform. So let's get started with the interface. So first and foremost, you have your dashboard. So what is your dashboard? Your dashboard is essentially a summary of all the information and reports that were gathered and and information that was got during a specific scan on a target. Alright, so as you can see, you have here a graph that is sorted and the data is essentially tasks by severity, which in this case is 0 because we haven't started any tasks or scans. Alright, we then have tasks by status that is essentially is a real world information that contains information about the latest CVEs. So the graph is it's displaying the total amount of CVEs released every year. Alright, so then you have your hosts topology. Now yours should be blank. The reason mine has actual hosts here is because I've performed a few scans with OpenVAS, as I do like working with it, even on a professional level. Alright, the next we have this little chart here that displays the NVTs by security class. So as you can see, we have the high, medium, low, and the log or information. So very, very similar to Nessus. So you can customize the dashboard by going to the little blue spanner. Alright, so if you click on this, it'll allow you to edit the dashboard and add as many or as much information as you would want. Alright, so once you're done, you can just hit save changes. Excellent. Now let's move on to the menu right here. So we've looked at the dashboard. Now when you move on to the scans, this is where you'd start a specific scan, or in this case a task. Alright, so it does have a dashboard, as will most of these other sections here. And the dashboard is essentially going to be a summary, in this case, of tasks, reports, and results. Alright, you can also add notes, as we'll be looking at in a few seconds. Alright, moving on to the assets. In the assets, you can add hosts and operating systems, pretty self-explanatory. It also comes with a dashboard section. You then have your security info, which contains information about the latest NVTs, CVEs, and CPEs. Alright, so just information about the latest vulnerabilities, which obviously we'll be looking at. You then have your configuration. This is going to be a very, very important menu, or a very, very important section when performing scans, because we have to configure a lot of stuff here in terms of adding new targets and creating our own scan configurations. Moving on to the extras. Your extras contain things like your trash can, your settings, where you can edit your username and your password. So if you want to change your password, you can go on there. Then have your performance. This will just informational statistics about your performance. Moving on to the administration, you have your users, so you can add or remove users. You have your groups, so you can add or remove users from groups and create new groups as well. You then have your roles, so you can assign or reassign roles to specific users. You then have your help, which contains your documentation and the about section. Alright, so let's get started with actually performing a scan with OpenVAS. Alright, so in this case, as I said, we're going to be checking for Linux specific vulnerabilities and Windows specific vulnerabilities. So we're going to do this side by side. Alright, so to get started with a scan, or actually before we get started, I'm going to be using Metasploitable 2 as my Linux operating system, and I'm going to be using Windows as my host operating system as the second, or the Windows computer. Alright, so to get started with a scan, it's really, really very simple. All you have to do is go into your configuration, and we need to create our own or a new scan configuration. So I'm going to click on scan configs. Alright, so it's going to take me there, and now you want to move all the way to the left here, and if you go through these little three buttons, you want to go to the little star here. The little star tells you create a new scan configuration. That's indeed what we want to do. You can look at the default ones that are created here, but for us, since we want to specify the plugins that we're going to be using, or in this case, as they're called, the vulnerabilities. So we're going to go and create a new scan configuration, and we're going to call it, let's call it, since we're using metasploitable, scan. All right, so we're going to call it the metasploitable scan, and we are going to leave the comments as empty because we do not need to add a comment, or if you want to, you can go ahead and do that. You can then select the base as empty, static, and fast, because when we select this, we're essentially saying we want to start from scratch and we want to create our own configuration. All right, so then hit create. Fantastic. All right, give it a few seconds to load up the secondary menu, which will prompt us to create our scan configuration. All right, so as you can see, you can now edit the scan configuration here, and now you can edit the network vulnerability test families. So these are sorted in terms of NVTs, and these would be the equivalent to the plugins in that we saw in Nessus. All right, so as you can see, the names are pretty much the same. You have they are considered to be NVT families here. So you have your buffer overflow, brute force attacks, etc., etc. So let's select which one of these NVTs we want to scan for against. All right, so it is essentially a set or a family of vulnerabilities. So in this case, since we're scanning for Linux, we can perform some brute force attacks there. We can perform some buffer overflow, compliance. Let's see what else we need to add there. Credentials, databases. Yeah, there we are, databases. Denial of service, default accounts, that'll also be quite interesting. FTP, that is also quite interesting as well. We can look at gain a shell remotely. If I can find it, there we are, gain a shell remotely. General, no, yeah, we can actually use general malware. Let's look for malware. There we are, malware, port scanners, and privilege escalation. Fantastic. And finally, we can just enable service detection. All right, so excellent. We have enabled service detection, and that is the last of the NVT families or plugins that we're going to be scanning for against, or the set of vulnerabilities we're going to be testing on our target. So I'm going to hit save, and now it's going to save the scan configuration, and the next step is to add our target. All right, so our target is essentially going to be the IP address of your target, or your target for that matter. All right, so what I'm going to do is, before we move on, we want to create the scan configuration for the Windows operating system. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into, we're going to create a new scan configuration, because we're going to do this side by side with the Windows operating system. So I'm just going to call it Windows scan. All right, fantastic. Excellent. Now we need to create our scan configuration. So leave it as empty, static, and fast. So create that. We now need to edit our scan configuration. So just give me a few seconds here. Let this start up. All right, excellent. So now the NVT families that we're going to scan for against are going to be brute force attacks, buffer overflow. Those are pretty much the standard. We can look at default accounts, denial of service. If I can remember the other ones, let's see, FTP, yes, gain a shell remotely. Also, that'll be quite important. FTP, gain a shell remotely. Excellent. We can look at port scanners, privilege escalation. Those are also very, very important. Port scanners, privilege escalation, service detection, SNMP, web servers. So let's look for service detection, SNMP servers, and service detection and web servers. So service detection, which we've enabled, web servers, there we are, and Windows Microsoft bulletins. All right, so those are the NVT families that we're going to be scanning for against our target. All right, so once that's done, I'm just going to hit save, and we've created our Windows and our Linux, Kali Linux scan. All right, so as you can see, if we just look at the current scan configurations that we have the metasploitable scan, and if we reload this, we'll have the Windows scan. So let me just reload that so you can see that indeed we will have the Windows one. All right, so there we are. All right, excellent. Now we need to add our target. All right, so we're going to go into configuration and to our targets. Excellent. All right, so in our targets, essentially now we have to add the IP addresses. So let me get the IP address for the metasploitable 2 virtual machine. So I'm just going to log in here, msf admin as the default credentials, and I'm going to write in the ifconfig command. All right, ifconfig, the IP address is 192.168.1.101. Excellent. So we're going to create the metasploitable target now. So we're going to create new target, go to the little star there, and we're going to call it metasploitable 2. and you can add a comment. Now in terms of the hosts, you can upload from a file, you can upload hosts from a file, you can select a singular host, which is what we're going to do, or you can select, an IP range or the entire subnet. So I'm going to just add the IP address for the Metasploitable 2 virtual machine, 192.168.1.101. Excellent. And I do not want to exclude any hosts. We're not performing any reverse lookups. In terms of the alive test, you can just leave that as the default. We do not want to perform any type of special ping attacks or pings, sorry, not attacks really. As for the credentials for authenticated attacks, since we're not performing any authentication attacks, we do not want to leave any default credentials. So I'm just going to hit create. So we have created the Metasploitable 2 target, and as you can see, the name and the target is there. The IP address is singular, and the port list is going to be the default IANA. All right. Now we're going to create a new one, and we're going to call it Windows. All right. And now we need to get the Windows IP address, the local IP address that is. So I'm just going to go into my command prompt, and I'm going to hit ipconfig. Should have launched that as administrator. So I'm going to do that right now. There we are. Let me just launch it as administrator. Right click there, run as administrator, and grant it administrator privileges. So ipconfig, and my local IP address is 192.168.1.104. Excellent. Let's go in and add that information. So 192.168.1.104. Fantastic. Now we do not want to exclude any hosts, and again we'll leave everything as it is, the default, and we're going to hit create. Excellent. So we have now created our 2 targets and our scan configurations. Now it's time to perform the actual scan on our targets. So in order to do that, you guessed it, we go into the scans menu and we go into tasks. All right. Now once we're in tasks, we have to create our new task, and the task is considered a scan. All right. So this is a little wizard. So we're just going to close this because we do not want to go through the wizard, and we want to go into the blue star icon again, and we're going to hit new task. All right. So new task, and we're going to call it, let's call it the Metasploitable. We're going to create the Metasploitable 2 task. Metasploitable 2 scan. We're going to call it the Metasploitable 2 scan, and the comment will leave it as it is. And as for the scan targets, remember we created it. So by default, it will detect it. So that's really, really awesome. So in this case, we're going to select Metasploitable 2 because that is the IP address. As for the alerts, we're going to leave that as it is. We do not want to schedule the scan. We want to do it right now. As for the scanner, leave the scan as the default OpenVAS by default. As for the scan configuration, you can leave that as it is. All right. More specifically, the scan configuration is very important because we need to select it. We need to select the scan configuration that we created. Sorry about that. I was referring to the scanner. So we want to select the one that we created, which in this case was the Metasploitable scan. And I'm going to click on that. And once you have selected that, we now want to hit create. All right. And next, let's do the Windows task. All right. So I'm going to create a new task here, and I'm just going to create it for the Windows so we can run them side by side to save time. All right. So we're going to call it Windows. We're going to call it the Windows scan. Again, you can call it whatever you like, and it's really, really up to you. I'm not going to add any comment. The target is going to be Windows, which we created. We'll browse all the way to the bottom here to the scan configuration, and I'm going to select the Windows scan. All right. I'm going to hit create and give it a few seconds, and there we are. Now we're ready to begin scanning, and you might be asking, well, how do we do that? All right. It's really very simple. So as you can see, the scans or the tasks are going to be sorted out really, really well. So they are sorted down this beautiful table in terms of their name, their status, their reports, their severity, the trend, and the actions. And now the most important thing to look at here is the status and the severity. The status will run in a bar, in this bar right here in terms of a loading bar from 1% to 100%. All right. It's going to display the progress in a form of a percentage. When you look at the severity will be displayed in terms of a scale. So a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest in terms of the severity of the vulnerabilities that were found, and 10 being the highest. All right. And finally, the actions allow you to control your scan here. So the green button is to start the scan. The gray dot button is to stop the scan. You then have the trash icon that allows you to delete the scan. You have your edit task, and you can then clone and export the task. So what we're going to do is we're going to start the Metasploitable scan. And once you start it, what I'm going to show you is something interesting here. As you can see, the status is going to show as requested. All right. Something very, very interesting here is you can change the refresh period of OpenVAS by going to the top right here. And as you can see, mine is set to refresh every 2 minutes. But if I want constant updates as to the progress, I can change it to something shorter like 30 seconds, or I can add my own value here. So I'm just going to change it to 30 seconds here. All right. And I'm going to start the other Windows scan right here. So give that a few seconds. And once I start it, the Metasploitable 2 scan should have started, and there we are. As you can see, by default it started and it's at 1%. Now this will take quite a while depending on the plugins or the NVs that we selected, and by default if you just refresh it, or it'll refresh itself, it will update you on the progress of the scan. Once it's done, we will explore what or the vulnerabilities that we have found, and we'll look at how to analyze the results. Alright, so let me just reload this and show you that indeed the Windows scan has started. Alright, just give it a few seconds. There we are. So they have both started, and I'm going to let these complete, and you should too. So I'll get back to you when these are complete. All right. So these scans are currently ongoing, and they've taken quite a while actually. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drive you through how to access, or how to get through, or how to analyze the reports and the results that you get in terms of the vulnerabilities that were found. So the Metasploitable 2 scan is currently at 48%, while the Windows scan is at 4%. It's been quite a while now. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go into scans, and I'm going to go into the reports. All right. So I'm going to go into reports here, and we're going to see what vulnerabilities that were found so far. All right. So for some reason that did not open up. So I'm just going to start it again. There we are. All right. So here are the reports. So as you can see, with Metasploitable 2, we have a severity of 10, which in this case is very high. So the scan results show that we have 5 vulnerabilities in the high severity, 12 in the medium, and 2 in the low. And in terms of logs, we have 62. All right. So if we click on this, if we click on the date exactly, which is what we're clicking on, it will show you all the vulnerabilities or all the exploits that are currently existent with that were found with Metasploitable 2 with OpenVAS. All right. So as you can see, we have, let's look at some of the most common ones or some of the useful ones. So for example, PHP MyAdmin, multiple cross-site scripting. So cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, we have that there. So we can check for an anonymous FTP login. So FTP logins are extremely weak on Metasploitable 2. Yeah, those are some of the vulnerabilities that were found. So as you can see, the information is displayed here, 19 of 198. So let's go back into reports here, and we can go through the information a little bit more. Okay. So looking at Metasploitable 2, if we go and look at the results, all right, this is very, very important. If I look at the results now will show you in terms, it'll show you the vulnerabilities in terms of the severity class, as it says over here through the dashboard. All right, and then it'll give you some graphical representations. So you can see here through the bar graphs. So the vulnerabilities that were found here were, for example, OS detection and consolidation reporting. These are all logs, that information that was found about vulnerabilities that can be exposed. All right, so that is what you would find in the results. And again, the information is sorted out really, really well here. Moving on, let us go back to the reports section here for some reason. All right, there we are. Let's move back to the reports. And if I click on Metasploitable 2 while the scan is still undergoing, that is under the tasks menu. As you can see, it'll show you some information about the scan. Moving on to the reports, as I said, when we're analyzing the results that we got, while the scan is still completing, because it's taking quite a while now. Again, for some reason, it is taking a while. So now if we click on the vulnerabilities that we were able to find on Metasploitable 2 again, you can see that if you click on one, for example, let's see, check for anonymous FTP login. So if I click on that, as you can see, it's going to give you information here about the vulnerability. So for example, you have the summary here. So this FTP server allows anonymous logins, something very, very, powerful there. It was possible to log into the remote FTP service with the following anonymous account. So anonymous, obviously that's the host. So openvs@example.com, FTP openvs@example.com. So as you can see, that is extremely exploitative. And if an attacker was to get a hold of this, it would be quite dangerous. Looking at the solution, these are the solutions that they give you, or means of mitigation to mitigate the exploits or the vulnerabilities. So if you don't want to share files, you should disable anonymous logins. Pretty simple, but a lot of people overlook this, and this is really fantastic for a network or a systems administrator. Let's look at the Windows scan. For some reason, that is taking quite a while as well. Probably have to optimize the scans a little bit more. So if I click on the Windows report, as you can see for the Windows report, actually, let me just go to the reports. There we are. So as you can see, the report is empty. We haven't got any vulnerabilities so far. But regardless of that, the scan technique or the methods of creating a scan, creating your own scan configuration, adding your host, and finally starting the scan is pretty much the same. And going about it with selecting the host is also quite important to do, and we looked at that. So I'm pretty sure this should cover everything with OpenVAS in terms of, obviously, as I said, going through what a scan is and a task, how to create your own scan configuration, how to select the different plugins or the vulnerability families, furthermore creating your own scan, and then finally scanning it. Alright, so that's going to be a wrap for section 4, where we looked at vulnerability assessment. Now let's look at a summary of what we learned in this section. Alright, so the first thing we looked at was how to install and configure NESIS. Alright, so we looked at how to install it and configure it, that being our first vulnerability scanner. We then looked at how to log in, and finally an overview of the interface. We then moved on to finding local vulnerabilities using NESIS, so vulnerabilities on our local operating system, in this case Kali Linux. Alright. We then moved on to checking for Linux and Windows vulnerabilities with NESIS. So this was more of checking for OS specific vulnerabilities. So we looked at how to find vulnerabilities on Windows and vulnerabilities on Linux. We then moved on to the next stage, which was installing and configuring OpenVAS, which is our second vulnerability scanner that we were using. And again, we looked at how to download, how to install it, and how to set it up, and how to compile the scripts. Alright, we finally finished off with OpenVAS, where we looked at checking for Linux and Windows vulnerabilities. So again, OS specific vulnerabilities. Alright, so that is going to be it for this section. In the next section, we'll be moving on to exploitation. So I'll be seeing you there.